This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include Keith Poston with the Public School Forum of North Carolina, Chris Fitzsimon from NC Policy Watch, John Hood, syndicated columnist and author, and Dr. Terry Stoops with the John Locke Foundation here in Raleigh. Over the 18-year history of NC Spin, the topic we've discussed perhaps more than any other has been public education. We're going to devote the entire edition of this show to the topic of the state of public education in North Carolina. I don't want to oversimplify what's a complicated subject, but let's begin by challenging some basic assumptions and common beliefs about public education, beginning with money. Whenever the subject is discussed, it quickly comes down to one side saying we aren't getting the results we want because the state's not investing enough money in public education. Now, on the other hand, we have those who claim that just spending more money doesn't dramatically improve results and that the basic problems lie elsewhere. Keith Poston, on which side of this postulation do you fall?
Well, I think, first of all, I think it's you can demonstrate that our schools in North Carolina are underfunded. North Carolina currently ranks 44th in the country in terms of per pupil spending. When it comes to how we're investing the money into the schools, I mean, I can look at things like our A to F school grades, and you see that the school systems that serve poorer children that are more resource constrained are the ones that end up being most of the D and F schools. Just this afternoon, I looked at the numbers from third grade and eighth grade reading levels, and when you look at the top 10 wealthiest counties, the ones that spend the most per student, 78% of those met all the measures, either met or exceeded the state level. You look at the bottom 10, only 2 counties in the state met them. So there's clearly some differences when you don't spend enough to make sure that those students have what they need.
But Terry, how do you stand on this, these two positions?
Well, this gets to the issue of what researchers call educational productivity and normal people call return on investment or bang for the buck. And when you look at what the research says about how school districts spend their money, you find that school districts that don't spend a lot get fantastic results. You have some school districts that spend a lot get very poor results. The Center for American Progress, a liberal think tank from Washington, D.C., has done some fantastic work in this area, and that's what they find. Most schools don't maximize the dollars that they receive from taxpayers, and therefore we find ourselves in a situation where the amount of money they receive is not necessarily tied to the student performance that they show.
So your position is it's how they allocate the money instead of how much money.
And this is the discussion that we need to have. All the media and all the discussion in the political realm is let's talk about spending levels. Well, I want to talk about spending levels, but I also want to talk about spending levels in relation to what kind of student performance is produced. And unfortunately, we don't really have those conversations, and voters' eyes kind of glaze over when you start talking about such things.
But Terry's getting to a basic point here. Right? The Constitution of North Carolina says that we are to provide every child a sound basic education. But we've never defined exactly what a sound basic...
Judge Manning tried. I mean, he talked about a qualified teacher in every class.
Encapsulate that.
Qualified teacher in every classroom being the most important thing. And I want to talk a little bit about the funding. Education is unlike, I think, any other commodity or however you want to describe it. Teachers and the school have no bearing on who's coming in their classroom. The kids are wildly disparate. You can't judge every teacher the same because their kids that they walk in the classroom are the same. Some school districts in low-income areas need more resources because they have tens of challenges for every kid in that classroom that wealthier counties don't have. So it's really hard to apply all these incredibly objective test score criteria and treat every county the same. The kids aren't the same, and the goal is to give every one of those children a sound basic education.
Okay, but again, we've never quite defined what a sound basic education is. Our friend Joe Mavretic, who was former House Speaker and NC Spin panelist, says, quote, "The mission of North Carolina's public schools, community colleges, and universities is to graduate good citizens who have the skills needed in the marketplace and the ability to enjoy life." How do you rate?
That's an absolutely fair statement of the goal of any education system. and it gets you about as far as everybody's saying that's a good definition of the goal. It doesn't really settle any of the actual policy matters in question. I mean, who's going to be against those statements? Here's what I would say about this issue of education funding. It is interesting to change the subject for a second to health care, because it's also a field that is highly dependent upon the nature of the patient, and it's humanistic, and a lot of the value is on the people delivering the service. And in healthcare, liberals say, you know, we spend all this money, we don't get nearly as good results as in other countries where they don't spend as much money to get better results. And then when we talk about education, the roles are reversed. The truth is, productivity is the key. There are plenty of places that spend lots of money on healthcare or education and get mediocre results, and there are lots of places that spend not as much money comparatively on those areas and get better results. I think we should be learning from the places that get the best productivity for the dollar. And then, of course, if we could spend more money on it by saving money somewhere else or something, I'm all for that, but we're focusing on the wrong subject.
But what I think Terry and John just both alluded to is the kind of thing that we hear. They say, well, if the schools would just work smarter, you know, if they would just be more efficient, you know, maybe run like a business, that they're wasting too much money, whether maybe the central office is too bloated. You go out into most of the counties outside the triangle, 85, 87 counties out of the 100 really fall into the category of low-wealth counties. I was just down in Lumberton just about a week ago talking to the superintendent down there, and I'm sure that he would love to hear about how much of the resources that they have there. But if you want to go down and talk to him, you better call ahead, because the central office is still flooded and closed from Hurricane Matthew. I mean, Greene County is the same thing. They are not in the same category as, say, a Wake County, Mecklenburg County, Orange County, where they can move things around.
So that raises a good point. The state basically provides the funding for teachers and curriculum and so forth like that. Should we be in a situation in which the state mandates on per child, we talked about per pupil spending, how much money is going to be spent for every child in every school in North Carolina, and eliminate these wealthier counties that are...
We do, in fact, have a variety of different streams of funds. Some are designed to supplement for low wealth or small counties, and a variety of other subjects. Actually, the funding system in North Carolina is so convoluted, has so many different pieces to it that are contradictory and are poorly administered. We absolutely need to redo how we fund schools, and that includes providing more state funds, and we already do this, but I think more efficiently, provide more state funds in school districts that have higher levels of poverty, higher enrollments of disabled kids that are more expensive to teach, et cetera. But we need to do it in a rational way. Our current patchwork quilt was not really designed in any rational way, and I think we need to try something different.
All right, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk some more on public education. We want to thank you for watching NC Spin on the air or on YouTube. Here's a reminder, there's much more on our website, ncspin.com, or NC Spin on Facebook. You'll find video footage not seen anywhere else, perspective pieces from our panel, and my weekly column. Be sure to get more balanced debate from the Old North State on ncspin.com, NC Spin on Facebook, or NC Spin on Twitter. After these messages, more on education.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
The slogan on our family farm is growing the next generation. It means using innovative technology to conserve water and increase yields. It embodies our passion for providing food and fiber for our neighbors near and far. It represents our desire to take care of our employees, our land, and to leave a better place for our children. Farm life isn't easy, but it's a good life, and I love what I do.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
We now return to NC Spin.
We continue our discussion on public education in North Carolina. Before the break, we were talking about funding and the importance of funding. One of the things about this is that the state is obviously responsible for establishing curriculum, setting rules and regulations, teacher pay, yada, yada, yada. And yet we give the funding large amounts of fundings to the local education authorities, LEAs, and we say we want them to have some local autonomy insofar as being able to how to spend it and how to administer it and so forth like that. Terry, when it gets right down to it, do we or don't we want the locals to have a whole lot of authority?
Yeah, they do. The General Assembly made sure that there is a great deal of flexibility that localities have when it comes to the state expenditures. Of course, the local money produced by taxpayers in that county that are allocated by county commissions, they have as much authority of that as they need. The most constrained pot of funding comes from the federal government, but that represents a fairly small amount of their overall budget.
So when they don't achieve the results that we think are responsible, what do? Just say, y'all didn't do very well with it, or do we start imposing rules and regulations on them?
Well, we asked those school districts to look at models that are working in North Carolina. And this is the problem, is that we have charter schools that are serving low-income kids that are in depressed areas that are getting fantastic results. And none of those lessons are translating into the traditional system. And so we have to ask ourselves, why is there such a resistance to take models that are working and not use those in the traditional system? I don't know if it comes down to pride. I don't know if it comes down to dislike of charter schools, but we really need to start learning these lessons.
When we started the program, you mentioned something in your opening remarks about being 44th in per pupil spending and so forth like that. There's a lot of comparison to other states. We're 41st in comparison on pay, or we're 44th in per pupil spending. And are these really apples to apples comparisons between the states? I mean, are all the inputs comparable one state to the next? Is all the testing comparable one state to the next? Is the curriculum the same from one state to the next? I mean, how can you compare what's going on in North Carolina schools with what's going on in South Dakota?
Well, you know, I guess the answer would be no, no, and no. They're not all that comparable.
Well, so do these rankings mean anything?
No, I think they do. I mean, some of the ones are certainly the things like teacher pay. They all try to include the same thing. So if there are local supplements and there is state funding and there are things like national board certification or master, they put it all together. So the total number, regardless of how it's sliced up, is pretty good. Now, it doesn't factor in cost of living. I think that there are some regional differences that are probably sort of regional looks and maybe more applicable. Now, per pupil spending and what it takes for, you know, to support a child, again, I think there are some things that we can learn from. But when you start talking about, look, we, you know, at the Public School Forum, we certainly thought that the idea of having you know, standards that were consistent and benchmarked from an international and national basis made a whole lot of sense. I don't personally think that there should be North Carolina math versus California math, but you know, we've had a lot of fights over that.
All right, Keith talked some, Chris, about teacher pay. The legislature, obviously this has been a big subject during the 2016 elections. The legislature, after many years, really started addressing, after the recession, started addressing teacher pay. 2 years ago, they came back and said that minimum starting pay for teachers is $35,000 a year for at least the first 5 years. Then they raised the pay in 2016. Governor McCrory touted the fact that every teacher, the average teacher salary in North Carolina is going to be $50,000 a year. During the debates, I found it interesting that both Governor McCrory and Roy Cooper said that's not enough. How much is enough to pay a teacher?
Well, there's a lot of ways to measure it. First of all, we didn't quite make the $50,000 a year average, by the way, the goal that Governor McCrory set. That's neither here nor there for this discussion. But, you know, part of it is when we get bright kids who want to go into the profession, when there's something called a competitiveness wage, when teachers are making some higher percentage. For example, I think in North Carolina, we rank near the bottom of, if you're a teacher, how much do you make corresponding to people with bachelor degrees in your state? In Finland, for example, it's 81%, I think. In North Carolina, it's about half of that. So part of it is we're trying to, you know, money isn't everything, and teachers don't go into teaching for the money. We know all those cliches, but it's a big factor, and we have to get teaching to be a competitive profession. If everybody agrees the most important thing in a classroom is a great teacher, then we have to pay people to be great teachers, and we're still not doing it. So I don't know exactly what the number is. We're not there yet.
But John, this raises one of the basic questions and assumptions, I think, and that is that for some reason or another, we feel like all teachers with the same amount of tenure ought to be making the same amount of salary. The legislature's talked a lot about differentiated pay. We know some teachers are better than others. We know some teachers teach different subjects than others. How do we go about setting up a pay system which is fair for the individual without having it an across-the-board kind of system?
Well, there ought to be solutions to that, the answers to that question. There are answers, plural, to that question. I don't think we should assume that any one model for differentiating pay on the basis of demonstrable performance or supervisors, judgment, or math and science and disabled kids being a higher value, harder to recruit. I mean, there's all sorts of variables. I would want school districts to try out, just like a lot of schools and charters and others and private schools have tried out lots of different models for this. I think that what we simply cannot accept, and what was the political default for a long time, is, well, it's impossible. It'll always be biased. It'll always be unfair. We're just going to have these standard statewide formulas. The standard statewide formulas have been silly for decades. I am very glad that we got rid of, for example, paying teachers more to go get masters and PhDs. That was a complete waste of money from the standpoint of educational value. And so now we're heading towards some more rational conversations, but I don't think there's going to be one answer to this question.
But Terry, one of the things that is very factual is that we've got a teacher shortage facing us in North Carolina. And under the circumstances, we know part of the problem with that is that teachers aren't going into the teaching profession, particularly in our colleges and universities. There's been a lot of talk about the fact that we're losing a lot of teachers to other states, a lot of teachers. You've written some pieces saying the facts are not exactly as they have been purported to be.
Well, we're importing more teachers than we're exporting, and that's important to note, is that teachers in other states where there aren't as many jobs available are coming to North Carolina to teach. Now, the challenge certainly is keeping them here in North Carolina if they're doing a good job to teach, rather than going back to a state or moving somewhere else. But these are typically young adults, and they're looking to move. They get married, they move to another state. There aren't a whole lot of things the state can do to address that particular problem.
But Keith, one of the things that happened is we had what was called a Teaching Fellows program in North Carolina for many, many years.
We know a little bit about that.
Yeah, in which, under the circumstances, we would pay the tuition for a college student if they would go and teach in the classroom for a minimum of 5 years. The legislature did away with that. Do we know why?
Well, there's a lot of theories about that, and I'm not going to entertain those right now. But I will say this. Interestingly enough, this past year, the North Carolina Teaching Fellows Program was essentially revived almost exactly the way it was done before, signed into law and with great fanfare by the legislature and the governor, but it wasn't our governor. It was Vice President-elect Mike Pence.
So it was done in Indiana.
It was done in Indiana. They called us at the Public School Forum to ask us all the details about how the Teaching Fellows Program was. But I want to go back to what Terry was talking about. Look, the fact is there's a lot of folks who try to convince us that there isn't a problem with teachers leaving the profession, but you can look at the numbers. Certainly, the declines in the enrollment in schools of education ought to be alarming. We're 30% down since 2010, 30% down. So the fact that the teachers that would be coming out are just starting to hit us now.
And Chris, while we're talking about the subject of teacher pay or pay in education, a joint legislative task force at the end of October recommended scrapping the pay schedule for our principals and assistant principals, and would allocate the money, just give the money, sort of a block grant type of situation, to the local school system and allow them to pay and set principals' pay as they saw fit. What's your reaction to that?
Well, the problem with principal pay is that we aren't paying our principals, not the way we were paying our principals. And I do think we need to figure out ways to give the best principals, maybe in the hardest the schools, the low-performing schools, some additional compensation. If a teacher's the most important person in the classroom, the principal, certainly the leader of the school, he or she has the most important job. But to be near the bottom in the country in principal pay, and then we can't. The problem is we have fewer resources despite the increases in the slight increase in the education budget. We're trying to divide up too few resources in too many areas, and we're starving one problem to fix another one.
Robin, Peter, to pay Paul.
Absolutely.
After these messages, we're going to continue our conversation on public education in North Carolina. Stay with us.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
The cost of everything has gone up dramatically over the last 75 years. With one exception, keeping electricity affordable. That's the power of your co-op membership. Learn more at togetherwesave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
You sleep on concrete till your body get immune to concrete.
My mom got my brother and I up and said, come on, we're leaving.
I became homeless in the beginning of this year.
When I was about 4 or 5 years old, our house caught fire.
I used to see my brother. If he see me, he'd turn and go the other direction.
We did the only thing that we could think of, and we went to a Salvation Army shelter.
You know, we don't have this, like, what's your background look like? We just say, what do you need?
I remember the man from the Salvation Army coming down with a box of clothes.
The Salvation Army officer bought my brother and I an ice cream cone.
Last week, my brother walked up to me, and he just started a conversation.
Today I've given my life to the Salvation Army because I remember what somebody did for me, my brother, and my mom over 30 years ago.
The Salvation Army for me means hope.
Compassion.
Family.
Support.
We now return to NC Spin.
Hope you're enjoying this special program dedicated to public education, and we thank you for watching it. We want to continue on this subject. One of the guiding principles in business is that competition makes everyone better. During the 1980s, we heard a lot about providing vouchers. Then in the 1990s, we started hearing about charter schools, and in 1996, we actually started experimenting with charter schools in North Carolina, giving them freedom and flexibility in abiding by rules and hoping that they would innovate. We've had 2 decades now with charter schools, and recent test scores indicate that charters are twice as likely to be graded an A in our grading system, but also twice as likely to receive an F in grading. So how are we doing on charter schools? I very quickly, I don't want you to talk minutes at a time, but how are we doing on charter schools, John?
There are some spectacular charter schools, and there's some really abysmal charter schools. As you were getting at, if you were to graph the results, you'd have these sort of lumps on either side rather than a bell-shaped curve. That just tells you that charter schools are still relatively new. You have lots of charter schools that have done very well, and they prospered or even multiplied into multiple locations.
Is that your assessment, Keith?
No, I think that's fair. I think there are some excellent charter schools, just like there's some excellent public schools. I do think, and I would agree with something that Terry said earlier, I don't think we've cracked yet how to transfer what is working in between each other. But I think I think part of it is because there are some restrictions that are placed on public schools about calendar and time that charter schools don't have to follow.
Chris, you hadn't been a big fan of charter schools.
No, well, I mean, I still think that we have a long way to go to make sure that they have the accountability measures in place and that all kids have access to them. And I think sometimes the results are skewed. There are charter schools in North Carolina that only admit kids that have passed a certain level of math. And then you look at the schools, and they're great schools, and the kids all do great because they come in as academic high achievers, and they're thrown into a mix. And we say charter schools are working wonderfully. So all these measurements have to be parsed.
Terry, what's your take on charters?
Well, I'm glad we have them.
You spoke to them a little earlier.
And I'm glad we no longer have a cap. It's hard to get a charter in North Carolina. There was a time where they were giving charters out to just about anyone. Now the process of getting a charter school, getting permission from the state, is absolutely rigorous.
All right, I want to get onto the subject of low-performing schools. Minorities, black and brown students do more poorly in schools than do Asians and whites. We find that the schools that are performing the worst typically have low-income students. Most of the time, single-parent families, the parents aren't well-educated themselves. How do we break this cycle, John?
Well, there's no question that socioeconomic circumstances affect students' ability to come to school ready to learn. That having been said, what we obviously want to do is find schools that have disproportionately disadvantaged populations that are doing well and figure out what they're doing and replicate it. Now, there isn't one answer. In some cases, it's a few brilliant people who you can't just clone them. But in other cases, you have, for example, in some schools, there's a lot of success with a very scripted approach, direct instruction, that really provides a lot of rigor and regularity to students that don't have it at home.
Well, that sounds like we're just shooting fish in a barrel, Keith.
Well, I mean, I think there are some commonalities. I think great schools have great school leaders and have great teachers, and then there has to be at least some threshold of basic funding and resources for those schools. But one of the things that I think is pretty clear from the research is that any of these types of efforts to really turn around a low-performing school requires more things. It requires more wraparound services. It means more things for the kids. They probably need a longer school day. They probably need a full year. They probably need after-school services. They need lunch, breakfast. I mean,
Terry, what's your
things.
opinion of what the legislature just did in setting up the 5 achievement school districts in the state to try to help some of these low-performing schools?
Well, I think it's good that we have a way to try this new idea to see if there is someone that can come in and turn around these schools. I mean, if they're not successful, the Achievement School District goes away. If they are successful, then they'll be giving more schools and raising student achievement for those schools. I think we need to give it a try, and I think that the Achievement School District can do wonderful things in North Carolina.
All right, after these messages, more on public education. Stay with us.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
It's a fact, patients who receive care in the medical home from a trusted family physician reduce healthcare costs through prevention, early detection, and affordable management of high-cost chronic diseases.
Every dollar invested in healthcare matters. Let's invest them wisely, building on North Carolina's medical home model. Better health begins with a medical home, a trusted family physician, the best return on our healthcare investment. Learn about the importance of medical homes at OurNCHealthcare.com.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
We now return to NC Spin.
On January 11th, the legislature reconvenes, and obviously education is going to be one of the topics of discussion, as it always is. I want to go around the horn very quickly. What do you see happening in the legislature as far as education next year? Keith?
I think you'll see more of the same, even though the Republican majority was elected on paying teachers and investing in education. I think a lot of the activity is still going to be around things like vouchers and charters.
You don't see any new initiatives?
I think you'll see focus on administrator pay.
All right, Chris?
I think the credibility of virtual charters is plummeting. I hope you'll see some more discussion about that, and I'd like to see some discussion about accountabilities and vouchers if we're going to spend that much money on it.
John?
I believe and hope that there'll be a lot of discussion about changing the way North Carolina funds its public schools, changing the funding formula.
Terry?
School facilities. We saw this come up in the last session. I think the rural communities are struggling with how to build and renovate schools. They're going to continue that discussion in January.
All right. Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. We hope you've enjoyed this discussion on public education in North Carolina. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback, and read my weekly column, be sure to visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. And join us next week when we return to our regular format and have more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing our state.